Yeah, so initially I learned C in college, actually a little bit in high school too, and I had previously taken Pascal and played with BASIC and assembly language. Mostly like 6502 assembly language, not really anything on the 68000. Um, we did a lot of Pascal in college and high school, and it was a nice language. It was better than BASIC, but then C came along, and it was just like a light bulb lit in my head, and I was like, "This is awesome. This is exactly what I want to play with." So out of high school, I had this job that was after school for a couple of hours here and there. It was at the New York City Board of Ed, and it was for a computer lab, and basically did sysadmin type of duties, hooking up things here and there, moving stuff around, whatever they needed to install. WordPerfect on this DOS machine here, that type of thing. They also happened to have all sorts of machines that came in from different vendors. So there were Commodore machines, there were Apple machines, there were all sorts of strange and bizarre things that no longer exist today. Yeah, so I mentioned this to you outside of this before, like in the 1970s towards 80s, you see this big Cambrian explosion of machines that pretty much all died out, and then all you have now is PCs, right? Out of that expansion, and then yes, you have Macs, but really Macs today are PCs, right? So this lab was kind of trying to get teachers trained on all this brand new computer technology, which is going to be unsustainable because of all this spectrum of different systems out there. So they had Macs. They had apparently Lisas at some point that weren't on display. They weren't being used. And so at some point I saw one that was in the hallway where trash was picked up from. And I was like looking at this thing. I saw the Apple logo on it, and I was like, what is this thing? And so I asked my boss about it, and I wasn't even so much as asking to take it as, what is this thing, right? And he's like, oh, the Lisa, yeah, you know what, take it home. It's yours. And so, okay, great. Now, I was a kid in high school. I didn't have a car or anything like that. This was in Brooklyn. I lived in Queens. So I called my dad, and he came with the car, and we picked it up and took it home. A few weeks later, some teachers that were involved with that center called me and said, hey, you took the Lisa before? And I'm like, yeah. Here's more stuff for it. Here's two more Lisas that you can have. Out of those two, none of them were actually, neither of them were actually working. One was completely dead, and I couldn't do anything. No matter how many boards I shuffled or did anything with, I could get it working. I wish I had kept the chassis for it, because obviously now they're valuable, but I didn't. I threw it out because, lived in a small apartment or whatever. And so I had these Lisas for many years, this pair of working Lisas. Sometime around 97 or 98, at this point, I was out of college, had a real job as an engineer, a systems engineer. I was into, back then I think I was doing, I regret saying this, but Windows NT and things of that nature, and some Unix on the side as well. I decided, hey, you know what? I haven't touched these computers in a long time, so I started turning on all the old computers that I had, and updating the software on them, cleaning them up, whatever. And there was the Lisas sitting there in the corner. I turned them on, and guess what? Neither of them turned on. So yeah, the capacitors leaked and whatever. I eventually bought new power supplies and new parts to replace the things that were damaged. But then I realized something. Yeah, I picked these things up from Sun Remarketing. There was a place where I can get all Lisa stuff from, but this is already no longer being sold by Apple. It's no longer being made by Apple. Apple's not ever going to make them again. I had previously used them to teach myself Unix by running Xenix on them. So a guy that I found on the early internet before the web came out actually introduced me to all the stuff that the Lisa can do, including Lisa OS and Xenix. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but Xenix was interesting because there was Xenix 286 at work, and eventually, that led me to learn Solaris and Linux. Linux hadn't existed yet at the time, and then eventually led to a whole career of things. But these machines were now no longer operable, and the idea came into my head that at some point will be possibly in the right now, as we're recording this, at a point where Lisa hardware will be very hard to come by, it'll be very expensive, and over time all of them will die and there won't be any Lisas left in the world. So because this is such an important machine, maybe we should do something about that. And what can we do? Well, I had seen other emulators out there. I knew it was possible. I wasn't skilled enough to write an emulator at that time. I knew C, which was kind of like the first building block that I needed to know, having learned it in college and really loved it, right? I didn't know C at the depth that I needed to in order to write an emulator, but over time I taught myself all the things that I needed. And the idea came like, hey, you know what? I should build this thing. No one else is. The internet had just started to come up. You see all these little tiny websites with bouncing icons and flashing sounds and things like that, like little blinky things and weird fonts, things that are on ISOI today. But there were a few pockets here and there of people that had websites about the Lisa. So one was Tom Steepleton's seldomly asked questions about the Lisa, which is, I think, you know, in my heart, that's like the classic Lisa website of the late 90s.
And real quick, can you just elaborate a little bit more?
So yeah, Tom had a university account on some Unix machine. And he had this little website that, hey, this is how you get into the secret monitor mode of the Lisa. If you hit Command S after you get an error message in the boot ROM, like if you tell it to boot off a floppy that's not inserted, it will throw you to an error, and then if you hit Command S, you can get into this nice little machine language monitor, which you can look at memory. So stuff like that was in there. So I contacted him, and I contacted other people around that circle of folks. And back then there were like these web rings where you would link your website to other websites that were related. So there were a bunch of Lisa websites. And eventually I found someone that had hooked me up with David Craig. So David Craig is a computer historian. He's also a Pascal developer, and he's worked with Lisas for many years. And he managed to somehow collect tons and tons of Lisa information. And I think this is basically, he was a developer and got in on their early developer seeding program that Apple had, and collected all these documents. And so he had them available. I had got in contact with him. He had eventually shipped me his copies of the documentation. I made Xerox copies because back then, no scanners and things like that. Nothing was electronic. I shipped it back to him, and I had all this documentation about the hardware that I needed for building an emulator. Now, this was not complete, but it was almost there. So I had the ROM source listing, which was kind of like an internal Apple thing, which shouldn't have been there, but somehow David got his hands on, and thank you, David, for that. That really helped things move along. The schematic was really, really useful. Although I'm not an electronics guy, I taught myself to read the schematics, because once I was able to do that, I could figure out exactly how the MMU was wired, what the various latches and things were, and where things were connected. So that helped a lot. The actual documentation about the Lisa applications themselves and how the OS worked, that was not so useful in building an emulator. But the low-level stuff, that was the best stuff, right? So I started slowly scanning all that stuff in. I didn't really have anything written, and I started putting it online. And there were a couple of other little websites here and there that, hey, I want to build an emulator too. And they started copying my stuff and whatever. But eventually, through David's help, and actually he acted as a mentor, I constantly emailed him back and forth, and I said, I run into this problem. What do you think it might be? I was able to get a mostly working emulator that started up, booted the ROM, and eventually passed Lisa tests. Now, it never ran Lisa operating system until the very, very end, and I got stuck on this for a very long time. I would say many years. I just put it aside and just left it there because I couldn't figure it out. And it turned out that the secret sauce was actually the MMU itself. So Rich Page had designed the MMU, and he figured out that the 68000 could actually restart some of its opcodes in a certain way. So the way the Lisa is designed, like most other memory management unit, when the CPU tries to touch a memory address that's not there, it causes an exception. And that exception gets written to the stack. And then that also includes some registers at the time of that event. And one of those is the program counter, which tells where to pick up the next instruction from. And it turns out that the 68,000 had incremented that by a certain amount. So if the opcode was 2 bytes long, it incremented by 2. If it was 4 by 4, 6, and so on, all the way to as many as like 12 bytes, right? So that was the actual secret sauce that was hidden in the operating system that made the MMU work. And by accident, I had run across some IEEE magazine article about the Lisa, which in hindsight probably David sent me, just as a, hey, check this out, look what I found. And there was some line of text in there where it just triggered an idea in my head. Let me look at that interrupt service routine inside the OS. So I disassembled it, and I saw that, hey, it's taking this value and subtracting depending on what the opcode was. Is it subtracting 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 16, right? And that was the key. Once I saw that, I added that code into the CPU emulation, and it started to work. And then from there, I had this mad rush to build a user interface for it and things like that. That eventually led to the emulator being published in 2007. I had actually made this thing universally compatible. I had written it under various forms of Unix. But I think the very first one was running on OpenBSD on a DEC Alpha and a Multia, which doesn't exist anymore, obviously. And eventually I moved to, as I worked with Sun machines in my job, I had my own little personal Sun machine, and then eventually became a Spark book and things like that I personally owned and brought with me to work. And then eventually I left at home and carried with me as a laptop and things like that. So it was developed in such a way that it would work across many types of systems, mostly Unix, and then eventually Windows and Mac as well. I found WX widgets. It was basically either Qt or WX widgets were the two leading cross-platform environments, programming environments that one could build a portable application in. And at the time, WX seemed a little bit nicer to write code in. And I think Qt had some weird licensing issues back then. Now it's less restrictive. And I wanted to make this thing open source and open, so that way we could continue to provide future updates to this. Yeah, so I've had a major release many years ago, maybe 2015 or so, and so the world's been kind of moving pretty quickly since then. If you have a modern Mac and you look at that, it has a Retina display, which is like this high definition display. LisaEm doesn't really do well with that. I had recently switched from Macs to full on Linux at some point, and I did get a machine with a high DPI display, which is the equivalent of Retina display, and it just looked terrible on there. So that's my primary goal right now, is to fix that. But there's other things that over the years kind of like crept in. So initially it booted Mac OS just fine, so through MacWorks obviously, and then Lisa OS has always worked and probably will always continue to work. But it cannot run Xenix, it cannot run Uniplus, right? So there's a competing emulator that does those now. So eventually I'll work on that as well. But originally, when I was about to release LisaEm, so James McPhail is a Lisa engineer that is very brilliant and has been working with Lisas for many years. He actually designed boards like the accelerator board and X Profile and things like that. And he's been around for many years supporting Lisas and has helped me quite a lot with the hardware side of things. When my Lisas broke, for example, I asked him for help, and he told me, hey, this is how you fix the power supply. This is the capacitor set that you need to replace. This is the most likely symptom and things like that. And he's helped me build the Lisa FAQ, which is the frequently asked questions. So Lisa List was a mailing list that existed for Lisa enthusiasts that help us maintain our Lisas and tell us, hey, if you see this error, this is what it means, this is the hardware that's available for it, and things like that. So between him and I, we put together this FAQ to help others who have Lisas and don't know what to do with them or don't know how to fix them. But James actually mentioned something that I had forgotten about, which is the Lisa doesn't have square pixels. It has rectangular pixels, and this was one of the hacks or one of the shortcuts that the Lisa team decided on in order to have more of a full page display, even though, well, it's half page display, right? But in order to be able to provide that document size, they said, well, we're going to make it a little bit longer vertically. And that makes it incompatible with modern hardware. So if you look at LisaEm, it's a little bit fuzzy, right? So there's different options you can look at to make it crisp, but if you make it look crisp, then the display is a little bit squashed. So he had mentioned this to me, and because of that conversation, the idea came into my head that, wait, you know what? Making an emulator is interesting, but why don't we make something a little bit more useful than that? We can build something that then will give you the experience of being in front of an actual Lisa. Now, if you have a physical, real Lisa in front of you, it's a big, huge, very heavy machine. It's like 50 pounds. It's about this big. It's very hard to describe through pictures or words the physicality of it and enormity of it. And when you turn it on, it heats up, and there's this experience that you have sitting in front of it where you feel the warmth coming off of it, the light shining off of it, and things like that. You can't get that through an emulator, right? But at least I can simulate the idea of a Lisa where you have the frame in front of you and you see the case and you can stick a floppy in there or push the power button and things of that nature. And that, I think, was something that I haven't seen any other emulators in that time when I wrote this thing do, right? To actually have the experience of interacting with a real Lisa is my ultimate goal. There are some major issues if you want to develop for the Lisa. You can't link things. Lisa Pascal Workshop.
It's an emulator versus it's not really running the Lisa Office system. Or Lisa.
Well, no, that's a CPU bug somewhere that I haven't tracked down.
Right. It's because you're emulating the hardware.
Yes.
Yeah, you're running real Lisa operating system.
Yes. However, there's a bug in the CPU emulation, and I haven't tracked that down. And so there's some operation somewhere, I don't know if it's a shift or a divide or something along those lines, where it doesn't properly work. And to bring up Tom Steepleton again, Tom Steepleton wrote this Mandelbrot fractal generator thing for the Lisa, right? If you run that thing on a real Lisa, it will show you output. If you run it on LisaEm, it will not show you output. It'll start to draw things, but then you get a black screen, because the math that it's doing is triggering the same opcodes that the linker is also doing when it tries to link something, and then it breaks. And there's also a bug in the scroll bars. Like the elevators and the scroll bars don't work right. And also the desktop menu, when you look at it, it duplicates some of the items. So there's still some warts in the CPU emulation that are wrong. So I got the CPU, I didn't write the CPU myself. The CPU code came from a Sega Genesis emulator from James Ponder in England. And it was complete enough for running Sonic and related games, but it wasn't a complete 68,000 emulator. It was missing, for example, the supervisor instruction sets and things of that nature, which I've added. But apparently somewhere in there, I either introduced a bug that wasn't there, or there was a bug already existing there that I haven't fixed, and I haven't found that yet. Eventually, I'll trigger it in some spectacular way that will point it out to me, just like the MMU thing that came up. And
so the Lisa emulator, it is running the real Lisa operating system.
Oh yes, it is the actual
OS,
yeah. Unless you run ROMless. If you say ROMless, then it does something called high-level emulation, which is basically when it tries to execute code out of ROM, instead of executing code out of ROM, the emulator intercepts those calls and does its own thing, right? So you can actually boot the Lisa operating system without having a ROM. So if you don't actually own a Lisa, but you have the Lisa software, you can still use LisaEm. Which, of course, because of bit savers and archive.org, that's no longer an issue. You can always get your hands on Lisa software.
You can go on, I think, a web browser right now and go on like an SE.
Mm-hmm.
Like
but that's a real emulator, though. That runs an actual emulator. Somebody wrote a C compiler called Emscriptem, I think, that takes actual C and compiles it, and you can take the Unix Amiga emulator core and run 68,000 code that way. So yeah, that runs a real Mac.
End up being a
that is possible. Yeah, that is certainly possible.
Because that'd be great, right? Because then it becomes more.
Yeah, but then you'd be downloading about 10 to 15 megs worth of stuff your browser before you can start it up. So yeah, like imagine a 10 meg profile plus ROMs plus some other stuff. Yeah, maybe you can compress that down to maybe 2 megs or 3 megs, but still, that's a pretty hefty chunk of code to download.
This,
yeah,
but it isn't necessarily on your to-do list right now or anything.
Eventually, I think I have so many bugs and things to fix first that those will come first, and that, the web stuff will come later. So 1262 is the latest and greatest, and I would suggest you get that from GitHub and compile it yourself, but probably by the time this is out, 127 will be out or 128 will be out.
For what platforms?
All of them. 128 and 127 will be out for everything.
So Windows.
So 126 is out for Mac, Windows, and Linux, but the bugs that I fixed that go to 1262 are more for things like Raspberry Pis and Linux.
Okay, so other people can make their own little Raspberry
Pi.
Yeah,
you can compile it yourself, and you can run it on a Raspberry Pi very easily, or any other Linux. So LisaEm actually spawned off a bunch of little sub projects that helped along. One of the earliest things that I had to do was I wasn't too sure of the CPU emulation, that I did all the correct things for all the things that I needed to do. So I actually wrote a CPU tester that ran on my next lab. So I wrote some code that would compile actually the CPU core out of generator and run it locally on a next, and then take that same opcode and run it locally and then produce output. And then I took all the outputs of these opcodes and compressed them down, and so they filled up something like a couple of gigs of data. And then I ran this against an Intel machine, a PowerPC machine, and I compared them, and luckily everything had passed. So that was one project. Another thing that spawned off was, well, you have this Lisa, but how do you get things in and out of it, right? So I started writing this thing called Lisa FSH tool, which is kind of a Unix-y term of file system shell. So it lets you open up.
Because you're your family.
Yeah, I figured.
So just keep that thought.
Yeah, so there were many projects that started out of this as kind of like side things that were related, that were important. So you have this Lisa emulator, you have this Lisa, you have all these disk images that you can use, but how do you get stuff in and out of it, right? So another one of the side projects that came out of this was a tool that will let you transfer files in and out of a Lisa. More out than in, actually, because I haven't fully reversed engineered the Lisa file system, right? So I started doing this thing called the file system tool shell, which is kind of a Unix-y term and kind of geeky and not very user-friendly in hindsight, but basically allows you to take a Lisa disk and then extract all the individual files from that disk. And then that's also a useful tool for reverse engineering, because now you can take a look at the actual software that's there and reverse engineer it with other tools and things like that. So I also started on the side project of that, which is how do I reverse the actual file system? And David Craig actually helped me find one of the guys that wrote the file system, but he didn't remember all the details. He just had some very high level rough ideas of what it was and how it worked. And he gave me some pointers. He had a notebook somewhere, but he couldn't share it because of Apple confidentiality and things like that. But that was good enough of a clue to get me started. Since I didn't have a lot of time, I cheated a little bit. So Lisa software has tags at the end of every block that identify what file it belongs to. So I said, you know what? I can just sort all these files by their tags, and I can get the files out that way, and that's good enough. That's not really the right way of doing things. That's more of a hack, but it was good enough to get started. At some point, someone from the Canary Islands, Natalia Portillo, contacted me, and she said she was very interested in file systems of various types and was interested in Lisa. And so I shared all the data that I gathered about this file system, and then she did a lot of tests using disk images. So she would stick in a blank floppy into LisaEm, create a folder, eject it, analyze the results, repeat again with a document, rename the document, and so on. So all these millions of steps that you have to do to see what changed inside of a disk image, she went through, manually did all those tasks, and then realized what the file structure was. Some things that she said triggered off some ideas in my head, and I looked at it and I said, wait, this is something that looks very close to a Unix inode structure. And it turned out that those things that are called extents in the terminology of the Lisa file system are actually inodes. And so they have a certain structure that looks very much like Unix. So you can kind of tell that the guys that built the Lisa Office system kind of had that Unix background to them, and you can see that there are named pipes in the operating system. And actually, the guide for Lisa OS 3.1 actually says don't use name pipes anymore. We're going to get rid of it in a future version and things like that. They have multiple processes that you can launch, and if you look at it, it's like somebody took Unix and rewrote it in Pascal. So that's a very interesting thing that came out of it, like from an archaeological point of view of looking into this OS that I knew very little about at the time. Yeah, I kind of ask myself that every once in a while, and I'm like, should I be really wasting all my time and resources on this? And it's really a fun hobby after all, because from a hobbyist point of view, this is one of the few machines where it's a very complex system, has a lot of history behind it. It's the starting point for much, much bigger things that came after it, but it's also something that you can spend many years trying to learn from and understand, and one person can actually learn the whole system in and out. And I mean that both from a hardware point of view and a software point of view, right? So you can totally learn everything a 68000 does, all the opcodes, the way it works, the way it functions, all the hardware around it. You can look at the Lisa OS guides themselves, look at the operating system that it has, learn all the system calls and functions that it has, and understand the whole thing. Look at the graphical UI stuff, understand all of it. It's very hard to do that with a modern system. So if I were to take the latest and greatest Mac OS, which right now is Mojave and Catalina is about to come out as we record this, there is no way in hell I could understand every single function call that thing had. And there's no way I could understand all the hardware and all the details about the hardware that it has. Not just because Apple closes all that information out and doesn't share it with you, but it's also become exponentially more complicated. So as a hobbyist, you want something that you can fully understand and sink your teeth into and go through many levels of understanding, right? So you can understand things from the Pascal level, you can understand things from the assembly language level, you can understand things from the hardware level. And I'm nowhere near the hardware level at this point. Like, I don't know the electronics all that well. Maybe in the future, that might be something I want to learn.
You didn't have to, really, though.
I didn't have to, but it was fun. And a lot of people seem to get a lot of pleasure from it. Yeah, I get it. It's like there's this emulator out there. I'm going to go play with it. They're probably going to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes on it if they can even find the ROMs and the software for it. And unfortunately, the legal laws being what they are, they make it hard for me to say, here you go, here's a package with everything that you need, and you can double click on it, here's Lisa. I can't do that legally. Apple still owns the copyright, and unless they say otherwise, I can't package it up for you. So there's still a lot of legwork to do, and for those few people that have spent that amount of time to boot up LisaEm and figure out, hey, this is what a Lisa is, this is what it looked like, this is what the past looked like, they get a little reward. And I certainly don't expect them to play with it, day in and day out for 20 years or anything like that. This is more of a historical preservation kind of point of view. And yeah, I do sink in a lot of time and energy and admittedly money into this, right? Because I have to buy hardware here and there, and I have to invest in machines that I can use for developing and things like that, and keep up the website and things like that. But yeah, it provides some pretty good rewards, I would say. So I mean, in like 5th or 6th grade, so this was middle school, I guess it would be called now, junior high school back then when I was actually there in Queens. I was introduced to Commodore PETs. And up to that point, I had no idea what I was going to do in the future. I had no idea of a career or anything like that, no clear view or anything. But when I saw that computer, I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. This is it right here. Some kids are like, I'm going to be fireman, I'm going to be an astronaut, whatever. That's, what they saw on TV, what they thought was cool. For me, this was like much brighter a bulb than that. It was basically like, this is my path. And I was a Commodore guy for many years, and went from the PET in school to owning a VIC-20, eventually to owning a 64, 128, and eventually Commodore went out of business. And I picked up the Lisa, and hey, this is a Mac. It's not exactly Commodore, it's not exactly 6502, but it's 68,000. It's got really kind of like the same lineage in some ways, if you go on the Apple side of things, right? So they went from 6502 to 68,000. This is really neat, it's cool. So it went from using a Mac, using the Lisa as a Mac, to I'm learning Unix on the Lisa. And I've got this other real Mac on the side that I'm using for day-to-day stuff, and I've got an actual PC. And this is the days of DOS and Windows, and Mac OS 6 and 7 and 8, and eventually, I guess, 9. But yeah, and it went to a life cycle of Apple selling this thing for crazy amount of money to nobody can afford it, to now it's available for cheap, to now it's no longer very much available, but there's this one company you can go to, which you can get it from, to, oh, wow, they went out of business too. Now all I got is eBay. And, oh, wait, there's Vintage Micros. They're a little bit expensive, but you know what? I can at least rely on the fact that they exist, right? So if I need something that I don't have, that I can't repair, at least I can go there and not, go to straight up eBay and pay insane amounts of money for parts, right? So there's that aspect. But there's also another aspect that I realize now, going back to that whole Cambrian explosion of all these machines that were really cool back in the day, right? There was a lot of hardware that I always wanted. Like, hey, I want an X machine. I don't have an X machine. I can't afford one. Oh wait, Next just went out of business, and there's all these slabs being sold on eBay for a few $100. I'm going to buy one right now. Hey, because why not? Now I have a job. I'm no longer a kid in high school lusting after machines that I can't afford. To now I have some disposable income. Yes, I have to pay rent because I have my own apartment or whatever. But you know what? I can swing that. I can swing that $500 for that next slab that nobody cares about anymore. And then it goes to these phases where now I can't find these anymore. They don't exist on eBay, and when they do, they're thousands of dollars as opposed to $500. So the Lisa follows that same curve as well, where things are initially crazy expensive, they drop in price as people don't want them anymore and move away from them, to now they're getting expensive and hard to find, and now they're getting crazy expensive, where you see a Lisa 1 being listed on eBay, I don't know about sold, but like for $65,000. And yeah. So there's this aspect of, there is a little bit of, I guess, looking at history and saying, back in the day, this was the cool thing, I wanted it, I couldn't have it, but now I can afford it because now nobody wants it anymore, but I can get to play with it anyway, just the same, and get the same enjoyment out of it. So I guess, the same kind of feeling that car collectors have, right? Maybe, I don't know.
Supply and demand always comes into play, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and even for new stuff, right? I saw a situation where a machine that was one generation older, I had a hard time finding memory for that was cheap. It was actually more economical not to upgrade the memory in my older PC, and I'm talking just generic IBM PCs here, maybe between DDR2 and DDR3, something like that, where DDR2 got really expensive all of a sudden. It was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna upgrade the whole machine and not bother upgrading the RAM and maxing it out, because it doesn't make sense anymore. So you do have that curve applied to just about everything electronic these days.